Hello again. Chapter 2, The Pond. The pond Sam had discovered on that spring morning was seldom visited by any human being. All winter, snow had covered the ice. The pond lay cold and still under its white blanket. Most of the time, there wasn't a sound to be heard. The frog was asleep. The chipmunk was asleep. Occasionally, a jay would cry out. Sometimes in the night, the fox would bark, a high, rasping bark. Winter seemed to last forever. You remember that sound I sent you? But one day, a change came over the woods and the pond. Warm air, soft and kind, blew through the trees. The ice, which had softened during the night, began to melt. Patches of open water appeared. All the creatures that lived in the pond and in the woods were glad to feel the warmth. They heard and felt the breath of spring, and they stirred with new life and hope. There was a good new smell in the air, a smell of earth waking after its long sleep. The frog, buried in the mud at the bottom of the pond, knew that spring was here. The chickadee knew and was delighted. Almost everything delights a chickadee. The vixen, dozing in her den, knew that she would soon have kits. Okay, let's stop. Let's look at 3 words in that sentence. The vixen, dozing in her den. Okay, dozing is something that a live creature does, right? Human, dog, animal, whatever, right? So we know that this is some sort of creature. We see the word her, so we know it's a female creature. The vixen dozing in her den. So what's a den? Think back to your kindergarten and first grade years of what you learned about animals. What animals live in a den? What could a vixen be? Just like a doe is a female deer, a vixen is a female fox. Okay? The vixen, dozing in her den, knew she would soon have kits. What's a kit? A kit is a baby fox. So what was the name for a baby swan? Cygnet. And a baby fox is a kit. The vixen, dozing in her den, knew she would soon have kits. Every creature knew that a better, easier time was at hand. Warmer days and pleasant nights. Trees were putting out green buds. The buds were swelling. Birds began arriving from the south. A pair of ducks flew in. The red-winged blackbird arrived and scouted the pond for nesting sites. A small sparrow with a white throat arrived and sang, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." And if you had been sitting by the pond on that first warm day of spring, suddenly, toward the end of the afternoon, you would have heard a stirring sound high above you in the air, a sound like the sound of trumpets. I'm trying to remember the sound the kids made last year when they made the sound. Ko-ho, ko-ho. And if you had looked up, you would have seen high overhead 2 great white birds. They flew swiftly, their legs stretched out straight behind them, their long white necks stretched out ahead, their powerful wings beating steady and strong. Ko-ho-ho, ko-ho-ho, ko-ho-ho. A thrilling noise in the sky, the trumpeting of the swans. When the birds spotted the pond, they began circling, looking for a place over from the air. When they glided down and came to rest on the water, folding their long wings neatly along their sides and turning their heads this way and that way to study their new surroundings, they were trumpeter swans, pure white birds with black bills. They had liked the looks of the swampy pond and had decided to make it their home for a while to raise a family. The 2 swans were tired from the long flight. They were glad to be down out of the sky. They paddled slowly about and began feeding. thrusting their necks into the shallow water and pulling roots and plants from the bottom. Everything about the swans was white, except their bills and their feet. These were black. They carried their heads high. The pond seemed a different place because of their arrival. For the next few days, the swans rested. When they were hungry, they ate. When they were thirsty, which was a great deal of the time, they drank. On the 10th day, the female began looking around to find a place to build her nest. In the spring of the year, nest building is utmost in a bird's mind. It is the most important thing there is. That's what uppermost means, the most important thing. If she picks a good place, she stands a good chance of hatching her eggs and raising her young. If she picks a poor place, she may fail to raise a family. The female swan knew this. She knew the decision she was making was extremely important. The two swans first investigated the upper end of the pond, where a stream flowed slowly in. It was pleasant there, with reeds and bulrushes. Red-winged blackbirds were busy nesting in this part of the pond, and a pair of mallard ducks were courting. Then the swans swam to the lower end of the pond, a marsh with woods on either side and a deer meadow on the other. It was lonely there. From one shore, a point of land extended out into the pond. It was a sandy strip like a little peninsula. And at the tip of it, a few feet out into the water, was a tiny island, hardly bigger than a dining table. One small tree grew on the island, and there were rocks and ferns and grasses. I thought that would make him go. "Take a look at this," exclaimed the female as she swam around and around. "Cahow!" replied her husband. So, boys and girls, who's talking now? It's the swans, and you are going to love them. They're so funny. "Cahow!" replied her husband, who liked to have someone ask for his advice. The swan stepped cautiously out onto the island. The spot seemed made to order, just right for a nesting place. While the male swan floated close by, watching, she snooped until she found a pleasant spot on the ground. She sat down to see how it felt to be sitting there. She decided it was the right size for her body. It was nicely located, a couple of feet from the water's edge. Very convenient. She turned to her husband. "What do you think?" she said. "An ideal location," he replied. "A perfect place. And I will tell you why it's a perfect place," he continued majestically. Think of Colin speaking majestically. "If an enemy, a fox or a coon or a coyote or a skunk, wanted to reach this spot with murder in his heart, he would have to enter the water and get wet. And before he could enter the water, he'd have to walk the whole length of that point of land. And by the time we'd see him or hear him, and I would give him a hard time." The male stretched out his great wings, 8 feet from tip to tip, and gave the water a mighty clout to show his strength. This made him feel better right away. If a trumpeter swan hits an enemy with his wing, it is like being hit with a baseball bat. A male swan, by the way, is called a cob. So we've got cygnets, those are babies, and we've got the male called a cob. No one knows why, but that's what he's called. A good many animals have special names. A male goose is called a gander. A male cow is called a bull. A male sheep is called a ram. A male chicken is called a rooster, and so on. Anyway, the thing to remember is that a male swan is called a cob. The cob's wife pretended not to notice that her husband was showing off. But she saw it all right, and she was proud of his strength and his courage. As husbands go, he was a good one. The cob watched his beautiful wife sitting there on the tiny island. To his great joy, he saw her begin to turn slowly around and around, keeping always in the same spot, treading the mud and the grass. She was making the first motions of nesting. First, she squatted down in the place she had chosen. Then she twisted around and around, trampling the earth with her broad, webbed feet, hollowing it out to make it like a saucer. Then she reached out and pulled twigs and grasses toward her and dropped them at her sides and under her tail, shaping the nest to her body. The cob floated close to his mate. He studied every move she made. "Now, another medium stick, my love," he said, and she poked her splendid, long, white, graceful neck as long as it would go, picked up a stick and placed it at her side. "Now, another bit of coarse grass?" asked the cob with great dignity. The female reached for grass and moss and twigs, anything that was handy. Slowly, carefully, she built up the nest until she was sitting on a big grassy mound. She worked at the task for a couple of hours, then knocked off for the day and slid into the pond again to take a drink and have lunch. "A fine start," said the cob as he gazed back at the nest. "A perfect beginning. I don't know how you managed it so cleverly." "It comes naturally," replied his wife. "There's a lot of work to it, but on the whole, it is pleasant work." "Yes," said the cob, "and when you are done, you have something to show for your trouble. You have a swan's nest, 6 feet across. What other bird can say that?" "Well," said his wife, "maybe an eagle can say it." "Yes, but in that case, it wouldn't be a swan's nest, it would be an eagle's nest. And it would be high up in some old dead tree somewhere, instead of right down near the water, with all the conveniences that go with the water." They both laughed at this. Then they began trumpeting and splashing and scooping up water and throwing it on their backs, darting about as though they had suddenly gone crazy with delight. "Caho, caho, caho," they cried. Every wild creature within 1.5 miles of the pond heard the trumpeting of the swans. The fox heard, the raccoon heard, the skunk heard. One pair of ears that did not belong to a wild creature. But the swans did not know that. Whose ears were those? Sam's? So boys and girls, let's go back a little bit. For me, it's the tippity top of page 12. Some of your books are going to have the same page number, some aren't. I want to go back to that part where the cob first says that it's an ideal location, a perfect location. And then he says, "I want to tell you why." And then he goes through and he lists the enemies of a swan. And it was done pretty clever. The author didn't just say, "The enemies of a swan are..." He said it very clever. He said, if an enemy, and then we've got that long dash, okay? Remember, it's kind of like if you've got the two commas. It's a bit of information that could be removed and the sentence would still make sense. But by having it there, it just gives you more to know about the subject. So we're going to learn more about, in this case, the enemies of the swan. So the sentence starts, if an enemy, almost like he's going, like a fox, a raccoon, a coyote, a skunk, wanted to reach the spot with murder in his heart. Boys and girls, you'll find this cob is very dramatic. With murder in his heart, he'd have to enter the water and get wet. And before he could enter the water, he'd have to walk the whole length of that point of land. And by that time, we'd see him or hear him, and I would give him a hard time. Because remember, the cob is very tough. So, 4 enemies of the swan. What are they? A fox, a coon, which is another way to say raccoon, right? A coyote, and a skunk. Just wanted to point that out to you. And then how about that part about getting hit with a trumpeter swan's wing is like being hit with a baseball bat? Whew, holy moly. Okay. Remind me not to make him mad, huh? Okay, Boys and girls, you'll find that the questions and everything for the Trumpet of the Swan, for the most part, are kind of shorter. What I really like about that, the comprehension questions for this one is I love how they give you those vocabulary words at the top. So pay attention to those. Maybe read them ahead of time, find them in the book as you're reading. I know we've talked about how sometimes those words can be spoilers, so it's fine if you want to wait till you're done and then go back and find them. Remember, use the context of the sentences to figure out what the word means. Boys and girls, when you're reading, especially now, you're done like learning to read. Now you're just reading to learn things or for enjoyment, you really do have to stop when a word doesn't make sense. That's what an adult reader does. And you guys are pretty much to the point of being adult readers. So don't let a word go by that doesn't make any sense to you. Be sure you stop and be like, wait, what is that about? Because authors don't put words in stories for no reason. If you couldn't figure out the word treacherous, it's important to, sound it out, work it out, find a dictionary, use the context, because the author used that word for a reason. Okay? Just something to think about. Like I said, you're adult readers now, so you have a different responsibility. Okay? Okie dokie. Talk to you later.